Good evening. My name is Marsha and I'm a very grateful alcoholic. I've been having such a good time, I don't particularly want to pitch. But that was my attitude when I first came here, so I'm one of those people who didn't make the program. I'm known as a slipper. I was a periodic who became daily. And so now I do, or at least I try and do what I'm asked to do. I'm here to share with you what I used to be like, what happened, and what I'm trying to be like today. And as they say, anything I say from the podium is just my opinion. And I guess after 15 years, they let you have an opinion. What I used to be like, I think I can sum it up very quickly. I was a mess. That's what I used to be like. I was born in Hollywood, and I have two brothers, a sister. My father was a Baptist and my mother was a Catholic, so that should tell you something. And my father's attitude was that people were no damn good, and my mother's attitude was that men were no damn good. And that's kind of how I grew up. The only thing that might be a little bit different about me is that I went to work when I was 6 months old in the motion picture industry. And when I was 11, I became a famous child actress. And that was the beginning of constant fear. I know what it is to suppress your emotions. In fact, I suppressed them so well that I wound up with a breakdown. And I tried at that time to express my fear. And I was told to sit down, shut up, and I didn't want to hear that when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. The first time I heard it, I wanted to kill. And let's see, at that time, it's part of my story that I really don't particularly want to talk about. I have a difficult time from the podium. I don't know why. I just haven't been able to understand it. But most of the kids that I grew up with of that particular era are dead because of alcoholism and drugs. And it's not, meant to impress you. It just happens to be true, and it's a part of my story. I think Chuck C. was the first one who taught me that many of us are called, but very few of us receive the gift. And anyone who is sober tonight has received the gift, and thank God I still am. As I kept trudging my happy road to Skid Row, as I call it, I don't know, I think I'm just going to bypass it because it isn't in my mind right now. Let's see, I married two alcoholics. And it's just my own opinion. Until you solve your own problem, you just keep marrying it, and that's what I did. It meant a great deal to me to drive up here today. In fact, it brought back a lot of memories. A lot of them were sad, but I'm very grateful that I'm sober, because many years ago, I used to be a guest at the Alisol Ranch, and that's where I met my second husband. But I have to tell you about my first husband first. I actually married him to get away from home, and I never left. We stayed right there. And I had two sons by this particular man. And I sought a divorce because he didn't want to get us a home, and I felt that if I showed him that I was going to get a divorce, that, he would find us a place to live. And I waited for 7 years, and that never came about. I raised my kids Catholic because he was Catholic. And at that particular time, I was going to raise my kids, and then I was going to become a nun. And I didn't make that. And my second venture was in religious science. I have my master's, and that didn't keep me from drinking either. So at that particular time, there was a depression in the motion picture industry. And it was the first time they called it that the communists had moved in, and we were all out of work. So I decided that I would get a job, and of course I was laughed at, because I was told, well, what can you do? The only thing you know how to do is act. And, that's all they need to tell us alcoholics, and we'll prove them wrong, and I did. And I got a steady job with a very prominent attorney, who I'm very grateful, because that man allowed me to work there, and at that time I did a lot of TV and picture work, but I always had a steady job to come back to. And during that time, I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous. I went to my girlfriend's husband's second meeting, which was on Hollywood Boulevard. And I can remember walking into that meeting, and I was very nervous because I don't like big crowds of people. They frighten me. And it was the first time that I'd ever walked into a room that I felt comfortable. And I asked them, how I could join. Of course, they all laughed at me because at that time, I didn't drink. And I was a late bloomer, and they said that I was welcome anytime I wanted to come. And during that time, that's why a lot of people think I have more sobriety than I do, because I have been around Alcoholics Anonymous for a good many years. And I started to play poker with some of the, I love to play poker with some of the people in AA. And I used to hear all of those things. And at that time, I didn't know what was happening to me, but you know, fear and panic was, you know, starting to become a part of my life. And, you know, having been a perfectionist, I didn't quite understand it. So I used to, you know, I was a sneaky drinker from the very beginning, because I came from a very strict family where alcohol was not allowed. And I used to carry this half pint in my purse. And I love us women, you know, as we're carrying, you know, the half pint, and it's going bloop, 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 and we think that nobody knows that we're drinking, you know. And this was not daily or monthly. It's just whenever that uneasy feeling came about. And I used to sit on that cold tile floor in the bathroom and keep, you know, and drink this half pint to keep myself from screaming. I had a very hard time. I was telling Ann earlier tonight, identifying, because when I first came, I kept hearing, you know, what wonderful times that everybody had with drinking. And I never had a good time with drinking, because I didn't drink to have a good time. I drank to kill my feelings. I wanted out. You know, I didn't want to feel anything. And that was my pattern of drinking. And so, as I said, as I kept trudging, and I'd saved enough money to bring my kids up to the Alisal Ranch for a vacation, and that's where I met my second husband, who I immediately told him that he was an alcoholic. You know, it takes one to know one. And, you know, he proved to me that he wasn't, and he quit drinking. And we got married, and you know what happened. And he knew that I knew who to call in Alcoholics Anonymous, and we were off and running to the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Now, this is part of my story that I like to get through very quickly. I used to be one of those women that would sit with my husband, and I would punch him at meetings, and I'd say, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" I am also one of those women who said, "What do you need to go there to learn how to be selfish? You already are." You know, and then I also became a member of Al-Anon, and I was on the board of Friendly House. We were known as the Pandoras in those days, as the non-alcoholic. I used to lead, you know, I don't know if there's anyone from Al-Anon, and this is no offense, it's just part of my story. I used to lead many of the meetings over in Glendale, and I would sit there and I'd listen, and I would say, my God, if I was married to him or her, you know, I'd be drunk too, and I'd go home and get bombed. You know, I just, I never quite identified. And there was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous who did interfere in our marriage. And it kind of became a gaslight story. And I hated everyone in Alcoholics Anonymous. In fact, I used to plan the bombing of the North Hollywood Radford group. And I had a tremendous list, and I won't tell you who was at the head of it. And you know, I closed the door on Alcoholics Anonymous while this bizarre story was going on. And, you know, during that time, that is when I had a breakdown, which I'm very grateful for, believe it or not, today. And I'm one of those people who went to a psychiatrist, who I'm also very grateful for. I love it when people get up at the podium and say they fooled the psychiatrist, because I've never known a psychiatrist that you can fool. They're way ahead of you. And he was the first person that I ever told that I was drinking. And he told me that I was a problem drinker, and if I continued on, I was going to be in serious trouble. And boy, did he know what he was talking about. You know, I never drank comfortable, because I knew all about this program, you know. And, you know, and it's crazy, because I hated that word insanity, you know, because I always had a secret fear that this was what was happening to me, that I was going insane. So, you know, I just didn't want to hear that word insanity. So a little bit about my drunk-along, I'll tell you. The fear and the panic was really beginning to take me over. And I was getting so that I couldn't get out of this apartment. And I was pulling the drapes, and I was withdrawing from life. And, you know, I would go to the market and try and remember what I was there for. And, you know, the booze worked for a while. I'm very grateful to booze, because I really think that it kept me from really losing my mind. And occasionally I would go to an AA meeting. You know, that's what's so crazy, you know, as we keep trudging our happy road to Skid Row. And this one particular night, I had been drinking, and I was becoming frightened. I was, beginning to see what was happening to me. And so I called this girl, and I asked her if I could come over, and I told her that I'd been drinking. And she said, yes, come over. I said I was trying to stop, and she told me to come. So at that time, I was living in the valley, and I got on the freeway. And I knew that, that I couldn't see, so I pulled over, and I waited for the police to come and save me, because I'd seen that on television, and they came. And I can remember him saying, have you been drinking? And, you hear enough of the program, and so I came up with this rigorous honesty, and I said, yes, sir, I have. And the next thing I knew, I was handcuffed, and I was in the back seat of the car, their car, and I asked them why they were doing this to me, and he said, you got to be kidding. And I noticed when they were booking me that he had a black eye. But I didn't know at that particular time that I had given it to him. And, they had a terrible time with me. They wanted me to take my boots off because they were looking for drugs. And they gave me a dime, to call. And, at that time I had so withdrawn from everybody. I didn't have any friends, and I really wasn't going to call my kids and say, guess where Mother is. So I called the time of day. Being an actress, you know how to improvise. And so I was having this conversation, and boy, that woman lieutenant didn't think that I was very funny, and I was treated very rough. In fact, I used to plan the murder of her. I was going to wait at the Van Nuys jail until she came out. But anyway, that was, they gave me the report, and I kept reading of the things that I said and the things that I did. And, I felt very comfortable. I felt very safe, and I felt very secure. And I didn't want to get out, because I knew, and I had known since I was 11 years old, that I didn't know how to make it out there. And I didn't want to make any decisions. I just wanted to be left alone. I wanted 3 meals a day, and they had a devil of a time getting rid of me, because I knew that the minute I got out that I was going to go home and get drunk. And that's exactly what I did. The insanity that they keep talking about, the minute I got home, my attitude changed. I used the program. I said, well, that's the thanks I get for being rigorously honest. And I was off and running on another drunk. The next time, I always say I graduated from the Van Nuys jail to the Beverly Hills jail. And, it's the same story. But somewhere in this sick mind, I don't know why I thought that God had moved to the beach, but that's where I thought he was. And I thought if I just moved, could get down there on the weekend, I could get close to God, something would happen. So I rented this room at the Holiday House. It's still down there up in Trancas. And if you can believe this, I drove over the Malibu Canyon, and naturally I was drunk, we mustn't forget that, and my tire came off the car. And you know what we do in these situations, I just kept driving. And I pulled into the gas station. I demanded that they put the tire back on my car. They asked me where it was, and you know what I said. And they got rid of me very quick, too. And then I pulled into the Holiday House, and I couldn't write my name, and I was very nasty to the receptionist, and she got rid of me, too. And I had rented the room that's right on the beach, that's big enough for 12 people, but I really wanted to be close to God. And so as I pulled in, and they had a platform larger than this, and I leaped up to get in the room, and I fell, and I broke my elbow. I didn't break the bottle, I just broke my elbow. And again, that was going to be the beginning of many, many spiritual awakenings for me before I finally surrendered to this program. That was the first time that I was alone. And, I was a person that always blamed people, places, and things for what I was doing. And that was the first time that my mother wasn't there, the kids weren't there, the husbands weren't there. I was there by myself. And, it wasn't that I didn't want to drink. I was in such pain I couldn't. And I called to the phone, and I did apologize to the receptionist, and I asked her if she would get me Alcoholics Anonymous. And she did, and they asked me who I might know that lived down there. And I said, well, I remember a Larry used to try and help my ex-husband. And they said, we'll get him, just don't go away. And sure enough, Larry called me, and he said, where are you? And I told him. He said, stay right there, and I'll be right over. And as I really hadn't finished hanging the phone up when he walked in, and I said, you're scaring me to death. He said, don't be frightened. He said, I was only 2 houses away from you. And I'll never forget it, because I had on a terry cloth bathrobe with nothing underneath that I had heaved all over, and that man put all my clothes in a bag, and he picked me up like a baby, and I do get emotional about it, because he since has gone, and he carried me into his home, and they had company, and I wasn't exactly what you wanted to present to company, so he hid me in the bedroom. And I'll never forget, their little boy ran into me, and he looked at me, and he said, "You know, I love you." And I wanted to run. And finally, Larry came, and he took me to the Malibu Receiving Hospital, where beautiful Lois came and helped me heave into the Pacific Ocean. And they put my elbow in a cast, and he drove me back to my apartment in the valley. And I can remember when he came in, he looked around, and he said, "Are you sure you're an alcoholic?" And I said, what do you mean?" And he said, "This place is so clean." And I said, "Oh, Larry," I said, "you don't seem to understand." I said, "That's all I do is clean this apartment, heave, drink, and clean this apartment." And it goes on 24 hours a day. I mean, really, you could have eaten off my floor. You know, I used to go around with a toothbrush and clean the light switches. You know, just insanity. And so he said, "Well, you stay here," and he said, "Some more people will come." And Freddie and Artie came, and Freddie looked at me, and he says, "You know, you're different." And I screamed at him. I said, "Please don't tell me that." I said, "I've been told that I was different since I was old enough to remember, and I don't want to be different. I want to belong to something." And he said, "You will come to understand that." And he said, "Now, just be quiet." Some more people came. And then Big Mike R. came, and Mike and I had done, some movies together, and he looked at me, and he said, "Well, you're a beautiful woman, Marsha." And, of course, you know, that phony ego of ours, I immediately started to raise up and be, the grand dame. And he said, "But you better take a good look at yourself." He said, "Who would want you?" Now, that may sound awful, but these are the things that eventually got me to surrender to this program. And he told me to be quiet, that Claire was coming. And Claire did come. And I used to say from the podium that I had never been hurt in the motion picture industry, because I didn't drink, but I'd forgotten. You'd say, I had forgotten. I was called back for retakes, and of course I wasn't in any position to go back, and Claire lied. She protected me, and she said that I was out of town, and I told her which clothes I wore, and she gave them my clothes so that a double could double me. And I was taken to the women's retreat up in Redlands, where I heard Father Barney give his interpretation of the Lord's Prayer to the 12 steps. And, as you probably know, I became very spiritual up there. But on the way down, she said something that hurt my feelings, and you know what I said to her. And I closed the door again, and I said, "Who needs Alcoholics Anonymous?" Now, to sum up this drunk-along, I decided, instead of going, to the beach on the weekend, that I'd move down there. And that's exactly what I did. My skid row was in the Marina Peninsula. I had a beautiful apartment on Westwind. That's it. And I tell you, as the big book tells you, that if you continue on, these are the things that are going to happen to you. And boy, do they know what they're talking about. Because I hung on to, I don't know if any, I would go to meetings and I'd say, "I don't do that. I've never done that. I'm here to tell you that I did it all before I surrendered." I used to hide the bottles in the hat boxes. I've never had a hat, but I had all these hat boxes, and I'd go out of my mind trying to remember, which hat box I put the bottle in. I fell in that apartment, and I got 5 cracked ribs. And, it was in my 5th year that I finally remembered, how I fell, and I fell in the shower. And, of course, I called the woman, who I hated, my poor mother, and, she came down, and I told this lie, about that I was on a Sabbath, is one of those little sailboats, and I said that, I was sailing, and it tipped over, and I went under the water, and as I came up, the sail came down. I told that lie so much that I became to believe it. I remember when I made amends to my mother, she kept saying, "You mean you weren't on this sailboat?" I don't know whether she really ever believed me or not. Occasionally, at that particular time, there was a beautiful meeting at the sheriff's station in Malibu that I used to love. I'm one of those people, I know what it is to sit in a meeting with booze on your breath, because I used to sit in the back at that sheriff's, and I would always manage to get out before the Lord's Prayer was over, except this one particular woman, she'd always say, "How much time do you have?" And, you know, I hate that word sick. That's not, you know, I milk being sick to death, because everything, I blamed everything onto, you know, I'd always say, well, you know, I've been sick. So I said to her, I said, I haven't made this decision yet. I said, you know, I've been sick. And she said, you sure are, honey. And if you don't, you know, she said, if you don't hurry, no, she said, you don't have much time left. You better hurry up. And then the next time I offered to help at a AA party, and she looked me right in the eye and she said, honey, you don't have anything to give. And that may sound unkind, but when I used to lie in that apartment in the marina, in my puke, I can't clean it up because that's what I used to do. These were the things that would go over and over and over in my mind. What does she mean I didn't have anything to give? Because I always thought that I was so loving and giving. You know how we, you know, cry and yeah, and so I was going with a man at that. I'm one of those lucky women. See, I knew that before I got here, that a man was not going to take my fear and my booze and my anxiety away from me, because I tried it before I got here. And this man didn't think that I, you know, was an alcoholic. And, you know, we were planning this marriage, and, you know, on October 31, that's the one thing that Clancy and I have in common, I used to say when I woke up, you know, but that's not true. You know, Lois corrected me, and she says, you mean when you came to? And that's exactly what happened on October 31st, 1969. I came to, and I crawled to the telephone, and I called this Mary up. And because I forgot to tell you, you know, I think I got up to telling people that I had 6 months on the program. And, you know, I said to her, I said, you know, I've been lying. I said, I don't think I can quit drinking. I said, but I can't stand one more day of this hurt in my gut. Won't you please try and help me? And she said, stay right there. And she came. And she took me to 26 and Broadway in Santa Monica, where, if you haven't guessed that I'm not dramatic, where again I screamed, you know, I'll do anything you tell me if you'll just take, you know, the hurt out of my gut. And now I don't know how much time we've got here. I'd really like to share my 15 years on the program. I surrendered that particular day, and I got to tell you, in my first year, you know, you kept telling me that the fear would go away, and I just, you know, I thought, when will it go away? I used to sit in meetings and keep my eye on the clock. I thought, when this meeting is over, what am I going to do? You know, how am I going to make it? I used to stutter. I had no idea that when you asked me to read Chapter 5 and the 12 steps, that it was going to help me overcome my stuttering, and that one day I would go back to acting. I didn't want to get too close, you know. I used to stand back because I had so withdrawn from people, and I was so lonely that I really didn't know how to act around people. I remember the first time I laughed, I turned around to see who it was, and it was me, you know. And, you know, if you're new tonight and you feel that you're not all together, let me assure you, you know, I never felt all together. I'm so happy they don't take pictures of you when you first come to Alcoholics Anonymous, because I'm here to tell you, I used to wear the mini skirts. Every time Luann's mini skirt would get shorter, mine would get shorter, and then I'd wear the boots, and I used to wear an Indian headband with a feather. I thought I looked adorable. You know, I didn't quit doing that, I think, until my third year. No, my fifth year. I'll get to that later. And I can remember that I was telling Ann tonight, the first time I spoke was at Clancy's meeting on a Tuesday night in Ohio. And, you know, I got up and I told you all about poor me. I had no idea that I wallowed in self-pity. You know, I just lived most of my life in self-pity. And that particular era, you know, I think that's one of the great gifts that Alcoholics Anonymous gives you, is to learn to live at a day at a time. Because in the era that I grew up, you know, it was the WPA days. They constantly, you know, it was fear, worry about, you know, I used to worry about what next week, and when next week got here, I was so exhausted, you know, with this fear and worry that I didn't know if it was good or bad. And, you know, you know, that's the great gift, learning how to live a day at a time. And anyway, where am I here in this story? That was my first, I wanted to tell you about being confused. You know, there were certain people that I would, you know, little Sheila, well, I forgot to tell you that. I moved back to Venice. At the beach, where it was on Pacific Avenue in Venice. I was right across the street from Muni's liquor store. I used to drive him crazy because I didn't drink anymore. And everybody knew that I was in terrible fear. In my first year, I sat up with the light on. I never went to bed. And, you know, I would call Sheila up, and I'd say, I can't drive this car. I can't come to the meeting. And she'd say, yes, you can, and she'd hang up. And I'd want to kill her, you know. But I did get in the car, and I did drive to where, and I can still see her. She was leaning against the car, and I'd think, oh, thank God I can get in her car. And she'd say, no, follow me, and, you know. But you see, she was the first woman who helped me to overcome fear. You know, she taught me to put one foot in front of the other, because the only way you get over fear is to face it. You know, there just really isn't any other way. I know, because I've tried them all. And then Beverly, I used to love her. She would let me come and spend one night at her place, because I'd been so long without sleep. And then I had to go back the second night, and if I couldn't make it on the third night, I could come back and go to sleep. These people I'm really grateful for. And then Red, a beautiful Red, he would come by every day to see if I was all right. And I'll never forget him. He stopped every day to make sure that I was all right. And certain people I would call, and this one, if you new people are confused tonight, and you know, I got to Jerry's. I was so afraid that he wouldn't wait for me. And I got there, I said, oh, thank God you waited. And he said, what's the matter? And I said, well, how do you like my new boots? And he said, I do. I said, God, I said, I don't know why they hurt. And he says, they should. You got them on the wrong feet. So if you're confused, it will pass. I wanted to tell you that it was Clancy, you know, when I heard him say that the alcoholic, you know, can't cope with life just the way it is. That's the first time that a shade went up for me, because I've never been able to cope with life just the way it is. I don't want to cope with it today, and I hate that word cope. You know, because coping to me, you know, most of my life I coped and I drank and I coped and I drank. So I try and use the serenity prayer, and I will remove myself until I can accept that cope just isn't in my vocabulary. Let's see here where I am. That was it. I think if anybody referred to me as that little child actress, I walked away from them. I did not like you if you discussed the motion picture industry with me at all. And in fact, I drove all the way down to see Chuck C. in my first year, and I told him my hatred of the motion picture industry, my hatred of women, my hatred of Alcoholics Anonymous, my hatred of men. He finally said, are you all through now? And I said, yes. And I thought, you know, he was going to tell me something great. He said, well, I'll tell you what you got to do, Marsha. He says, you got to close. Oh, I know. I went to him specifically because of religious science. And he says, you've got to close the door on all of that and surrender to Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's exactly what I did. And in my first 2 years there, I went back to work for this attorney that I told you about. And I worked, and, you know, I had to work, because if I stayed home and thought about me for 2 hours, I would not be standing at this podium tonight. And I'm very grateful to the people who encouraged me to get a job and to keep my mind occupied. And that's what I did in my first couple of years. And I guess at that particular time I got a call from an old friend who asked me if I wouldn't come to lunch, and I did. And this particular attorney, you people had given me some self-esteem, and I didn't like the way he spoke to me, and so I quit. And he didn't think I'd quit, and I didn't think he'd let me quit, and there I was. I was without a job. So this particular man who took me to lunch handed me a script and asked me if I wanted to go back to acting. So again, I drove all the way back down to Chuck C., and I told him my hatred of the motion picture industry, and I went on, and again, he said to me, are you all through now? And I said, yes. And he said, do you have a job? I said, no. He said, do you have any money? I said, no. He said, somewhere there in the big book, it does tell you that you will go back and you will relive and you will do it sober. And so I went back. And I'll never forget it, because at that time, I didn't think I could remember lines. I went back to a studio that I had spent most of my life. I went to school there, and as I got out of my car, there was a member of AA. As I walked in on the set, there was a member of AA. There was a member of AA to take me to lunch, and it's one of the nice things that I do like to share, because without them, I would never have been able to have made it. And it's funny, because when my agent called and said, you did a good job, you know, there's that phony ego again. I said, well, I guess I love to use to put you on, use the phony voice. And I said, well, thank you, darling. And he said, but they cut you out. I said, I beg your pardon. That's what I call being rigorously honest. I did not get involved until my third year, and I thought I had met Mr. Wonderful, and I thought, you know, we were going to be Mr. and Mrs. AA, and I learned how to ride the motorcycle, which I still adore today, and I'm ahead of myself here. Back up. I'm one of those women who did not get a sponsor until my third year, and it is not a good way to go. I thought this, you know, I used the psychiatrist, but somewhere along the line there, I felt that I had one foot in the door and one foot out. So I surrendered to this woman who was my neighbor at the Venice Beach, and you know, I'm very grateful to her, and she taught me a great deal. And I remember taking my inventory. You know, I was so afraid of what she was going to think of me. And, you know, everything I said, she taught me. And I got so interested in her inventory that I forgot about my own. You know, so don't worry about taking an inventory. And anyway, getting back to this romance, you know, and, you know, we were going to move in together, which I came home one day and my furniture was moved. And I was so thrilled. I mean, what a dingling, you know. I was so excited that I was going to live with somebody. It lasted a week. I just agreed and he threw me out. And there I was. My furniture was there and I was out in the cold. And again, I went to her, and she told me that if I couldn't accept somebody the way they were, that I was to remove myself. And that's what I did. And I kept, you know, our imagination, I kept thinking, well, he's going to see the light, and he'll come and get me, and we'll be off and running to AA, but he married somebody else. And that was the first time that I was really in pain on this program. You know, I kept hearing everybody say, well, you'll walk through the pain. I didn't even know what they were talking about. Walk through the pain. I was gasping. You know, I thought the pain was never going to leave. And I talked to her, and she said, now, I'll tell you what you're going to do, Marsha. She said, you're only going to talk to me about this situation. And she said, and the day will come when I'll tell you that we will no longer talk about this situation, because if you want to get over something, you'll quit talking about it. And sure enough, I called her one day with the latest bit of gossip, and she said, Marsha, she said, today is the day that we will no longer talk about this situation. And I wanted to kill her. I really did. And so she made me change all of my meetings, you know, and, you know, I was still down deep, was still planning to bomb Radford. And, you know, but one day I found myself going through the door because I was in such pain. And I had changed all of my meetings, and I didn't know where else to go but Radford. And I sat down, and I heard beautiful Mary C. And she talked about losing her daughter on this program, and that she had been in so much pain. And her cry was, you know, why, God? And she followed instructions. Her sponsor told her to go to meetings, and that every time she put her hand out and somebody put their hand out in return, that we were all in the process of being healed. That we're how did she say, we're in the process of overcoming our inferiority complex, that we're in the process of a feeling of unwanted, of not fitting in the world. And, you know, that particular moment, that was the end of that fear. But I got to tell you, if I had known what was ahead of me in Alcoholics Anonymous, I might not have joined. I am not one of those people who's going to get up and tell you that everything has been wonderful for me. It has not. I've been trudging, gasping. And I thought by now that I would have the house with the picket fence. I don't. I thought by now I would know, you know, where I am in my job. I don't. The things that have happened to me have just been fantastic, because the one thing that the program does teach you is it will teach you, you know, how to live and face the problems, you know, that I still have. And the program is right. That's exactly what it's taught me. And I'm very grateful that I don't have to turn to the booze to take the pain away. At that particular time, I moved back to the valley. Everything, you know, it's funny, everything that I said I would never do, I've done, so I'm very careful of what I say today. You know, I was telling Ann, I hate this particular job that I'm on, but every day I go in and I say, I love this job, I love the people, I bless my car, you know, I go all through this, you know, and it just drives me crazy, because, you know, you don't have to believe it, but I believe it, that anything I hate, I'm going to hang on to, and, you know, as long as I love it, eventually, you know, I'll get rid of it. So I'm trying, you know. I'll let you know if it works later. Anyway, getting back to my story here, where am I? Oh, I got some time here. Let's see, that was, where was I? My third year there. Okay. Then I moved back to the valley, and occasionally I would act, occasionally I would get a steady job. Really, to tell you the truth, I don't know what all I've done, but I'm still here. And I used to be one of those people that was very pompous, I hate to tell you, and I would hear people sit in meetings and say they had a desire to drink, and I would go, isn't that awful? Yeah. I did, and it happened to me in my 5th year. It happened at 7:30 in the morning. I'll never forget it. And I'm telling you, I thought I'd go out of my mind. I called Ruth in Glendale. It lasted a week, and she stayed with me until, it went away. Naturally, I've never said, I've never criticized anybody who's had a desire to drink, since. You do have to be careful of what you say here, let me tell you, oh, that's what I wanted to tell you. At that time, my sponsor told me to go down and surrender at Alcoholics Anonymous Central Office. And I am so grateful. I was sharing that a little bit with Ann tonight. I did. I went down there as a volunteer because I was trudging through this broken romance. And, I stayed there for 3 years as a volunteer. And I can still remember, people we used to call up, and, if they'd cry, I'd start crying. And Carol, who was the head of Central Office, he was a man, he'd come out and he said, what is this with you? He said, this is supposed to be a happy organization, and we've got you crying on the phone. And they taught me, how to be tough, and they taught me the proper way of helping another alcoholic, which I'm very grateful for. But it is funny, when I was drinking, especially at Boys Market in the marina, I'd come in and the box boy would look at me, and I was, I'd go to the manager to report him, I was drunk, but luckily I'd have to go to the ladies' room and have a little stiff shot, so I never made it to the manager's office. But it's funny, this one particular woman, I asked her to make a 12-step call, and she asked me why I was calling her, that she didn't do that anymore. So naturally, I got up. I was going in to report her to Carol, and I did. I reported her, and and I said, she doesn't walk like she talks. And he looked me right in the eye, and he says, that's none of your business, Marsha. He says, it isn't any of your business of who doesn't walk like they talk. He says, the only thing that's your business is, do you walk like you talk? And I've never forgotten that. I had people that, I am so grateful. They did, they did not make it easy for me because I was, I bounced in and out like a ping pong ball. I was sharing also with Ann tonight, I came from a very strict family. I was told what to do, how to do, when to do, and I didn't want anybody to tell me what to do. And the women, I so loved them, they knew that. And I would go and I would ask, and I remember Lois, she said, oh, I don't know, Marsha. She said, I tried it this way. She said, I don't know if it would work for you. You might try it. And as long as they talked to me that way, I would go and try it. But if you told me that I had to do it, I would I would rebel. It's, where am I here now? That was around the 3rd or 4th year. I think it was in my 5th year that I announced to my sponsor that I was getting bored with meetings. And she said, oh, you are? And she says, give me your book. And I handed her my meeting book. She went through it. She says, do you see all of these meetings? She says, you go to all of them, and then you come back and tell me that you're bored. She says, never tell me you're bored. I never did. I never did. It was just really wild. I'm telling you. It's funny because all of these people are so important in my sobriety, and I'll get to that in a little while. I think it was in my 7th year that I had to take my mother to the motion picture hospital where the woman I hated, where I watched her die of bone cancer. It went in her brain. She went totally insane. And she had fallen and broken her hip. So if you can picture this, here she is. They pinned her together. They didn't even want me to touch her. They were afraid that I'd break a bone. And I walked in one day, and she says, I'm very worried about you. I should tell you, I should clarify this. My family has never recognized me as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. They just don't want to talk about it. And so I went in, and she says, I'm very worried about you. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, I know you haven't been going to meetings. She said, but when this is over, she said, you will go back, won't you? and that means a great deal to me today. I don't know why, if any of you can identify this, but when things don't work the way I want them to, I get mad at God, I get mad at Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, and I start damning everything. Excuse my profanity, because I don't like to use it from the podium. And this, I really didn't think that I could take one more day of watching her suffer, as I was sitting mad at God, mad at Alcoholics Anonymous, thank God I had some time, because it is true. When all else fails, God could and would if sought. And I did get a moment of being quiet. And the week before that, my mother was Catholic, and I started to say the Hail Mary, and she raised right up, and it so frightened me that I stopped. So this particular night, I started it again, and as soon as I was finished, my mother passed away. And I can't tell you that I saw anything, but I know that my mother did, because I saw her. But I am aware that there was a presence in that room. It was suddenly, I don't know how to explain it, it was suddenly like we were cut off from the world. And I've often said my mother died to restore my faith in God, because I've never argued about a higher power since then. I'm very well aware of a higher power that I'm truly very grateful for. What was it I started to say at that time? Well, it slipped my mind. I think that at that time, I know, I said to my sponsor after that was all over, why didn't I have the little house with the picket fence and the husband? And I said, it's in the big book. She said, I beg your pardon? She says, get the big book. I got the big book. She said, go through every page and find. And there I was sitting going through, and I never found it. It's not in the big book. So, so that was the end of that. It's really, I'm not putting you on, it's really true. I've had some wild experiences on this program, let me tell you. I think around that time, I would like to share this. I did hear these tapes. I was telling Ann tonight of Alan McGinnis. He wrote A Member's Eye View. It was there. There it is. I see it over there. If you hadn't read that pamphlet, get it. But these tapes helped me, so very much. He told me, let's see if I can remember that. He said the two deadly things that you have to watch out for is if only and what if. And I got to tell you, I spent most of my life with what if and if only. I don't know if any of you had, but that was really my theme song. And he said there will come a time in your sobriety when leading meetings, making the coffee, emptying the ashtray, so on and so forth, will keep you from taking a good look at yourself. He said, you got to sit down sometime and take a good look at yourself. And that was when I decided to quit the miniskirts, take the Indian headband off, and I changed. I hope for the better, and I'm very grateful to him. I was sharing with Ann too. He says, have you ever noticed that they tell you to pray for the SOB, but they always get all the goodies? And it's true. I was praying for this man that married somebody else, and he did get all the goodies, and I quit praying for him because I knew he was all right. And I started to pray for myself that I'd get over the resentment. And he also said that he had no understanding of a higher power, of God. And he said as he had come to understand that if he did, then God wouldn't be necessary. And I understood that, because anything that I've ever thought I understood, I walked away from. And I'm very grateful to these tapes. He also said, he says, they keep telling you to trudge the happy road to destiny. He said, have you ever noticed nobody tells you where it is? And I identify with that, because I'm still trudging the happy road to destiny. Let's see what has happened to me since all that particular time. That was somewhere in my 7th year, and I think I got to the point where I didn't want to take my cake because I felt that I didn't have anything to say, and you know what she said to me. Now, the point of all of this that I'm trying to bring up is that Joe, who introduced me to Alcoholics Anonymous, went out after 5 years and died of alcohol. My beautiful Larry, who had 18 years of sobriety, he went out and died in less than a year of alcohol. My sponsor is still out there. I can name all of them. And my beautiful Mary that taught me about reaching out to another person took her life last year, sober. And you know, all of these things have just really kind of ripped me apart, and I don't understand, you know. But all I can say is they gave to me, and you know, they are responsible for my sobriety tonight. And I'm very grateful to them. I know Chuck C. taught me that, you know, if you're going to give something and expect anything in return, you'd better not give it. He says, but if you give it and you get something back in return, he says those are the added pluses in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I've never forgotten that. It seems there, as I kept trudging along, I did go back, you know, in the motion picture industry a couple of years ago. You know, I got on a series and I thought, oh, this is it. I'm back. You know, I'm here to stay. And the girl quit the show because she got tired of it, and I was her landlady. It seems to me that every time I put my hand on the door of success and I go to open it, it falls off in my hand. You know, that's really what my life has been like on Alcoholics Anonymous. But the program has taught me how to live with unresolved problems, which is something I never knew anything about when I came here. You know, I've been taught not to take the program for granted, you know, not to take my sobriety for granted. I have to be very careful of that, and especially being a slipper, I'm very well aware of that, because a lot of times I don't want to go to meetings, and that's when I go. And a lot of times I get bored, and that's, you know, but, you know, speaking of that particular woman, I remember the first time I told her that I'm bored, she says, you know, you better look at yourself. She says, you may be boring to people, you know, and, you know, it sounds awful, but I've learned from it, you know, and you know, it's you know, it's very true. Let's see, I've gotten quiet here. Nothing is coming through. I think God wants me to shut up. And that's true. You know, that's true. I always played Florence Nightingale. You know, that was my facade. If you needed me, I was there. You know, I was a people pleaser from the very beginning, and especially with my father. I always wanted his approval, and I'm sure that he was one of us. And I've had to watch out, you know, in sobriety, you know, to be Florence Nightingale. That's why I'm grateful to Central Office for teaching me really how to help the recovering alcoholic. Because if anyone had allowed me to really lean on them and let them carry me, I wouldn't be here tonight. You know, a lot of times I would like that today. You know, I'd like you to come and take all my problems away. But, you know, it just doesn't work that way. I'm working right now. I work on an answering service. I went there. I planned to stay 3 months. I've been there 3 years. I think I can share this from the point, because it is funny, about the man who asked me for money on the program. And I told him, I said this was particularly a new guy, and he asked me if I could loan him some money. And I said, hey, I said, you know, I only make $3.50 an hour. And he looked at me. He says, my God, you've got to get a better job. Isn't that wild? That's true. That's honest God's truth. I've never forgotten it. Every time I see him, I break out laughing. And occasionally I act. So what I'm trying to say today is that I don't make any plans. You know, I don't try and predict what's going to happen to me. I know that I was in such awe of women when I came here. You know, I really felt so unclean. You know, I really felt that I wouldn't be accepted. And I know no, it was Lois who told me. She said, always remember there's somebody ahead of you and somebody in back of you, and at all times you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And I hang on to that today. Also I can remember calling Luann, because for you newcomers, I had a devil of a time functioning. It was hard for me when I was new to get dressed, and occasionally that comes back. Occasionally I get, I'm sure some of you must feel that, I get confused and I can't function, you know, and you know, and I can remember calling her and crying and saying, you know, I can't get dressed, I can't make a decision. And she said, for God's sakes, Marsha, she says, can you accept yourself where you are as you are today? And I hang on to that today, because sometimes I do get confused and I can't function, and you know, I throw my hands up in disgust. Because, you know, I I do know that the first drink, if I know nothing else, I do know that the first drink will take the pain away. For me, I know that that the second drink I'm going to fall down, because that, we are so cunning and we are so baffling. I was going to show the police that they were never going to arrest me again. So I would park my car and I would walk that speedway down at the beach. It's a wonder that, that I wasn't killed, I fell down. So I've always been, I was taught that any time that the desire to drink comes back, to think it out, to think what the first drink will do, what the second drink will do. And I know the third drink I'll be arrested. I'll probably move up into second place, It just seems that once you start getting arrested, it goes bing, 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 bing. Because I went for a long time driving the car drunk, that I should have been arrested many, many times. I think it's about time. Yes, we're getting there. And when something isn't in my mind, I'm not going to try and say it. For the newcomer, if you don't want what I have, it's okay, because most of the time I don't want it either. And that is what I call being rigorously honest. Just keep going to meetings. I kid you not. I kept going to meetings. I thought if I'd hear one more person talk about what a good time they had with booze, I wasn't going to make it. And I finally heard of Milton, and he's the first person I identified with. I guess I was ready, because from now on, every speaker that I hear, I identify. It's the emotions. I'll say this about men. I had no idea. I've always been in awe of men, just a little bit afraid of them, that they had the same emotions that I do. And when the first time at a participation meeting, and I started to hear men talk about the way they felt, it may not sound very much to me, but it was a big gift to me, and to hear, all that childhood that I speak of, I'm not trying to down it. Oh, I meant to tell you that I do want to clear that up, that in my third year, I kept telling you how much I hated to be an actress and blaming my mother, and I had to admit in my third year that I'd always loved, acting, and, that's what I call about, being rigorously honest. And, because I always tried to be something else, and, today, I love it when somebody asks me how I feel, and I say, well, I'm a little uptight today, and especially, the non-alcoholic. I've had more people come up to me and say, do you really feel uptight today? It may sound corny, but it's a great, because on my job, I really can't talk to them the way I talk to you people. It's very comforting to me to know that I can go someplace and I can scream if I want to, and that you're going to understand me. Alcoholics Anonymous has really, made me a woman, and, it's made me face life on life's terms, which is something I've never wanted to do. I really don't, to really end this my pitch of being honest, if you tell me to go left, I want to go right. I don't want to follow the rules. I'm sure you can identify. I really don't want to. I don't dig it out there. But I dig it in here. And if I had any resentment left, and I'll end it by saying, that now that I found you, I don't know why we can't go to the seashore and live happily ever after. But, the program has taught me that anything is possible if you believe. And today, I really do believe, and I owe it all to Alcoholics Anonymous. And in closing, I'm very grateful to Ann for asking me to come up here. We went to dinner tonight. I think she's a gem. We've done nothing but laugh. I've had such a good time, I really didn't want to pitch. But, for you newcomers, just keep coming back. That's the only thing that we can offer you right now. And eventually, your mind will clear and you'll begin to identify. And it's a nice way to live. Okay? Good night.